Around Leeds, there are rumours of a list that exists deep in one of Victor Orta's many notebooks. On that list, there are a large number of players broken down per position on the football pitch, all of whom are potential replacements who can be brought in at Leeds United should the need arise. Hello and welcome to Orta's List, a new series on All Stats Aren't We, which is dedicated to scouting footballers around the world in a bid to create our own version of Victor Orta's List. I'm John McKenzie, and I'll be joined throughout this series by All Stats Aren't We's very own Josh Hobbs and Scouted Football and Leeds Live's own, but also a little bit our very own too, Joe Donoghue. Joe, how you doing?
I'm very good, John. Thank you again for having me on. Very much enjoyed the last one on left back. So really looking forward to sort of sinking my teeth into this one.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know what we're going to talk about, we are talking about eights who can also play as defensive midfielders. Josh Hobbs, are you excited about the prospect of chatting about midfielders today?
Yeah, very much so. A bit more, a bit more glamorous this time than left backs. As much as I enjoyed last time, I think there's a little bit more to get into, such as the nature of the role.
So just to lay out the format of these shows, so you know what you're getting into, we're going to spend the next hour talking about central midfielders. We'll begin by talking briefly about the position itself and what we're looking for from a central midfielder in a Marcelo Bielsa system. And then we'll reveal our 4 potential targets before profiling each one. We'll end the show by talking valuation and close by picking our best option in the position. And for those of you who are wondering, we're going to be using 5 Yards as our platform to scout and buy players. 5 Yards is an online transfer market for fans where you can prove you can spot talent. Their prices reflect nicely those of the current market, and there's some great scout reports on there too to help inform our decisions. So last time out, we bought Romain Perrault. Great pronunciation there.
You nailed that, mate.
Do you think? Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, it's always important to pronounce things well. I think we'll all agree. That means that we are left with 82 million for the other positions that we're looking at. And we will talk about them from here on in. So let's start off with you, Josh. We want a quick overview of the position itself, the sort of play that we're looking for, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion about that, but then we'll just jump in with our players that we've already picked. So Josh, what are we looking for in this position?
I think essentially we want to replace the Forshaw profile in the squad, and we know that he's coming back, and we're very excited that he's coming back, but also I think we're accepting the fact that he's got a long way to get to the level that he was at before. He may never reach that. He may not even really play for us again. So that's definitely a hole in our squad. So essentially that player needs to be comfortable in possession, able to help us control games. We've struggled in that sense this season. Our games have been pretty chaotic. I think Forshaw always helped us sort of control the game by us having the ball a bit more rather than constantly just having to win it back all the time. Maybe this player play the role that Dallas is currently occupying, but to a higher technical level. I guess a question for us as we go through this, can we find somebody as mobile as Dallas? I think that's actually one of the biggest challenges. The other thing about Forshaw was that he could play a significant amount of minutes at DM if needed. We know that Phillips gets injuries and suspensions. So yeah, we've seen Strauch play there like 700 odd minutes this season, and then Click's done a bit there. Shackleton's even done a little bit there. So it's really important that they can do that role as well. And I think we feel that having a player who starts regularly in 8 but can drop back into that role if needed seems more the way that Bielsa operates than the idea that we would buy a young backup who doesn't really play that much. Doesn't seem to be his style. He would rather have a player he could regularly start and move where he needs to. So that's the theory.
I'll get to you on this, Joe, quickly, because Josh has mentioned there that we're looking for someone who can maybe do the Stuart Dallas role. And this is a fairly new role we've seen this season. In previous seasons, because Leeds have controlled the ball so much in the Championship, we've sort of had two fairly attacking eights who play in a pretty similar manner, even if one of those players may be more naturally attacking than the other. But what we've seen this season with Stuart Dallas is a player who plays a little bit more zonally, doesn't press as much maybe as we've seen in the past, and is able to drop in alongside, help out with build up as well. So almost like a mobile double pivot with Kalvin Phillips at times. I'm just wondering about how you went around looking for players who sort of fit that profile, and sort of how you see that profile going forward. Do you expect next season for Bielsa to be looking for a direct replacement for that kind of Dallas role, with maybe a little bit more of an attacking outlet in that position? Or do you think that Bielsa wants to ideally move to a position where we are controlling games like we were in the Championship, and so he'll want maybe a player who we think of as being a little bit less defensive in that sense and a little bit more attacking? I just wondered what your take was on that.
I mean, it's all second guessing, really, isn't it? Up until we actually find out who the players that Leeds are actually identifying as potential additions. I think. I mean, we can talk about the Dallas mold all day long, but until Stuart Dallas either breaks or just drops off a cliff in terms of his form, then I don't really see there's any reason for him to not be in the team. So for me, sort of what I was thinking of what we should be looking for was I had a bullet point list of the attributes that or the particular facets that this hypothetical player would need, and it was sort of one of positional discipline, good pressing intensity, not elite level, but a decent level, and the capability to make progressive passes into the final third, to have a good diverse range of passing, and can also operate as that auxiliary defender in the defensive third in the same way that Kalvin sometimes regularly does. Because obviously we've seen that Pascal Struijk can do that. He is a centre half, but when it comes to the progressive passing, the passes into the final third, that's perhaps where he's faltered, and as a result, Leeds have faltered in build-up in those games where he's had to deputise for Phillips. So I think, without sounding crass, it's probably more of a Kalvin Click hybrid, if there is such a thing, essentially, that we should be sort of identifying.
And I think just one more thing to add to that is one of the things I was thinking about in terms of build-up is that we use our eights often to form a triangle in wide areas as well. So that was another thing that I was sort of had at the back of my mind. So, the build-up you see between the fullback and the wide player, and then one of the eights on either side will push in and help out in that build-up phase. So that's the other thing that I was looking for as well. But we don't want to just talk about the theory behind the players. We want to talk about the players themselves. So now is the moment for the big reveal. The big reveal. So here are the four players that we have selected for this week's episode. They are, no surprises here, Josh Hobbs's favourite footballer of all time, Teun Koopmeiners. We've looked also at Lille's Boubakary Soumaré, Manuel Locatelli, and we've got an interesting option from the Championship in Max Bird as well. So we're going to work our way through these four players, and then at the end we will have a chance to talk a little bit about honourable mentions. We will also talk a little bit about the under-23s potential that we could get through here as well. But let's begin with you, Josh Hobbs, with Teun Koopmeiners, a player who you've had sort of an eye on for a little while. We interestingly, we did consider him in the summer as a potential replacement, but decided against him. But you're coming back strong on him. So talk us through Koopmeiners and what you see in him as a potential.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you mentioned about last summer, because I think I have to say I hadn't really watched him that much when we were linked with him at that point. But I knew that he was a more defensive-minded midfielder, and it was around the time where we were being linked really heavily with Rodrigo de Paul, so it didn't sort of make sense if it seemed to be at that point we were talking about a Pablo replacement, and obviously he's not that. But I've watched him intently since then, and I feel he would be great in this role. He is the captain of AZ Alkmaar, and I think he has been since last season. Joe, you might know that better than me, but he's 23 and the captain.
Joe is our captain's expert here. Yeah.
No,
every captain.
I just know that Joe knows a bit about the Eredivisie as well. That's why I asked that. But he's basically a beast of ball progression. He is unreal at those passes, dropping into the sort of left back channel. He's left-footed, by the way, which I think makes him a guarantee on Orta's list anyway. But yeah, drops into that left back space and just pings balls over the top. I could see Bamford really thriving on those balls running in behind. Rafinha getting in behind as well. He strikes the ball just so true in those balls over the top, and somehow manages to just weight them perfectly. There was a assist that he got for Osama Idrissi against Ajax last season, where he just pinged it over the high line of the Ajax defence, and he ran straight onto it and scored. That great ball striking, also incredible for set pieces. That's not necessarily what we're sort of looking for here as a top of the list, but something worth mentioning. There's a threat in the box from corners, and I think he would give us additional height defending, which we definitely need. Not that he is really tall, but he's physically sort of got a large build. He's strong, and he's aggressive in the air. I think he's really natural in Phillips' position, but I think he could play in this 8 role. RZ sort of play a double pivot at times with him and Midtjie. I've probably butchered his name as well now, but he plays a little higher up than Phillips in the single pivot for Leeds, and he is used to receiving the ball from the kind of angles that you would receive the ball as an 8, as well as the angles in build up as a DM. So I feel like that's my starting point on Koopmeiners, but I know you guys will have some thoughts as well on him.
Well, before we get into that, should we read through you had an extract from
I
5
did
yards
have an extract.
Cope. I'll put that on the screen
now. I
now.
It straight away. Yeah. I've had an absolute mare there, but yeah. So he's highlighted as well. He's outstanding in the air, and also that he's got that mix of long and short passes, not afraid to take the ball forwards. Yeah, so getting the same sort of thoughts that I was pulling out there.
Yeah, and I should say as well, I'll mention this because Joe is involved with Scouted. This is their new handbook, and in the Scouted handbook this time around, there's a whole profile of Koopmeiners in there from famous McTominay hater Kees van Hemmen. But I can only recommend Kees's piece on Koopmeiners, mainly because he's not talking about Scott McTominay, but it is a really good piece. It is a really good piece. I really enjoyed it, and it's a really good overview of his abilities there. Joe, I'll come to you. You will have seen Koopmeiners quite a bit. He's obviously one of the darlings of the scouted community. So, what's your general take on Koopmeiners?
Yeah, very much like him. Obviously watched him last night for the Dutch under-21s. They drew 1-1 with Romania. And he started the game really well. I thought he was, keeping the moves ticking and was very neat with his passing. But I think there was a bit of, it was probably to do with the Dutch structural setup in that 4-3-3 that they had a bit of an issue sort of trying to make those incisive passes. It was kind of down to Noah Lang, and Koopmeiners was probably a bit too deep to be making those incisive balls. But in terms of him as a player, I think he's very much I think his strongest position. I think he's very much a pivot man, much like Phillips. We know he's had that experience playing as a central defender for RZ, and just on the ball, he just looks like a very steady-handed presence. Which I think for a player of 22, 23, you don't always get that. He definitely looks a lot older than he is. He plays a lot older than he is. And, to sort of be watching him at an under 21 Euros championship is kind of a bit, are you sure that he's supposed to be there? It's one of those. But yeah, he's a player that I like. I think in terms of what Josh was saying about his range of passing, I think that's probably one of his his standout attributes that, for example, an Orta's list player we should be looking at, because it is varied. Short distance, it's clean, it's crisp. It's usually, he doesn't dilly-dally on the ball. Middle distance, it's pretty good. Again, very clean, very crisp. But long range, he has a variety. He can play those balls high over the top. He can switch. He can make those line-breaking passes. He's not, this isn't a drawback, but he's not sort of as much of an athletic competitor as you might see as a Premier League number 8. So if you were sort of expecting Luke Ayling type lung busting runs from deep, from that left back space that Josh was talking about, then perhaps that's what you're not going to get with Koopmeiners. He's much more of a steady, positionally aware presence in that sort of, what would be that single pivot. But if say, for example, Leeds were looking for, I keep using the word steady, but it probably is the best way to describe him. Instead of playing two very attacking number 8s, maybe playing a bit more of a dedicated number 10 who transitions to an 8, and a 6 that transitions to an 8. An 8 that transitioned to a 6 rather, then I think that Koopmeiners would fit in quite well there. It's just whether the mechanics and the dynamics of that would work. But certainly as a player, I do very much like him. I rate him very highly. I think his ceiling is much higher than the Eredivisie. I'm not on. By the way, on him being captain, I may know captains of every club, but I don't know the single game or the day that he became captain, that he was finally given the armband. Sorry to disappoint you, Josh, but I don't have that off the top of my head. You put me really on the spot there.
We'll quiz you on the next episode.
Mate,
we'll have a list of captains.
That wasn't that wasn't what I was meaning, but I've made a right muppet of myself there. But
no.
There we go. I think interesting you saying sort of about the sort of mobility thing, because that's what I've got as, I guess, my concern with him. I'd say sort of out of this list that we've got, he's probably the least agile on the ball. But I think what he does is he moves the ball quickly so that he doesn't need to sort of have snappy turns and things like that. He's just calm in possession and keeps the ball moving. But defensively, he's not going to cover the ground that Dallas is covering. I think we know that. But it's not to say that he's sort of lumbering or slow or can't do the job. It's just that I don't think he would do that role to the same ability, I guess, in terms of the covering ground, every blade of grass in midfield. But I do think he's very aggressive in terms of going to win the ball, very physical. And I know for a fact that Victor Orta has described him as a warrior in terms of going to win the ball. So he's
That's
liked in
hyperbolic at all.
Not like Victor at all to be hyperbolic.
I think he was talking about him as a centre back when he told. I think if you want hyperbole, I believe he called him like a young Sergio Ramos in that regard.
He's very much. I know a lot of people don't like the phrase quarterbacking role, but he very much plays in that quarterbacking role for RZ. Also for the Netherlands yesterday, was dropping out a lot to the left hand side of the field, filling in behind Mitchell Bakker, pushing forward, and just sort of dictating from there. And I think there was a lot of criticism of him after the game yesterday online, and I think he's expected to do a huge amount of influence of the game from actually quite a deep part of the pitch. I guess I'm interested in a couple of things. One is, to what extent do you sort of lose his edge to an extent by having him play further forward? And the other one, I guess, would be in terms of ball carrying, because that's again something I think that Dallas does really well, in that he can pick the ball up and he can just progress it through sort of running into space. And as you said, Josh, he's a mobile player. And it's great to have that as an option. So I'm interested in both of your thoughts on that. I'll start with you, Joe. What do you make of those two things? Do we lose the sort of dictatorial? That sounds, I don't think that's the right word because it makes him sound like Mussolini or something. But that ability to just sort of sit deep, pick the ball up, and as you said, Josh, he if he's put under pressure, he can just move the ball on quickly. But if he's given space and time, he can progress the ball quite nicely, like either way. Do we lose that by playing him slightly further forward? And I guess the second one being, like, how do you rate him as a ball carrier?
I think in terms of the dictatorial role, the warrior that Koopmeiners is, I think in terms of if you were going to start him in a midfield, you've got that trio where you have Phillips as the pivots, the single pivots sitting at the base, and then you'd have Koopmeiners as the 6/8. In the middle, alongside probably Rodrigo, you'd think. I think in terms, I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, well, he's not an elite level ball carrier, but I mean, a lot of sides do get by without that. I think when you have ball carriers like Luke Ayling and potentially a left back who's an adept ball carrier, then that means that you can perhaps have players who are a bit more passive in that sense, who are predominantly progressive passers in the middle, because you can funnel it down the wings, and especially with players like Rafinha, if Jack Harrison, both players who like to come inside. It's not as if the entirety of your build-up would be hinging on players who are tending to stick wide. I would just wonder about the mechanics of playing with Koopmeiners and Phillips in the same team, because you've got two quarterbacks there. I mean, I hate the term. I really can't stand it, because maybe it's because I've heard Steve Bruce describe John Joe Shelby as that so many times. But, I wouldn't quite describe him as a quarterback or an athlete, but that's beside the point. I think having those two, Koopmeiners is very similar to Phillips in that sense, and I mean, is it sort of the law of diminishing returns when you have two of those players in the same position, essentially, or trying to sort of put Koopmeiners a little bit further forward because you think that he's going to be good with his line-breaking passes? I mean, I don't know. I personally would prefer a progressive carrier, somebody who's typically a lot better at progressive carrying, who's a lot more mobile, who can drift through lines, who can progress the ball just sheerly simply by getting on the end of runs like Dallas does, because we know that Bielsa really isn't going to change his setup. So while Koopmeiners and Phillips as a double six would be great in terms of ball progression, as a 6, an 8, and a 10, does it necessarily work? I'm not entirely sure. But I think it would be an interesting experiment, to say the least.
Before I come back to you on this, Josh, we'd have a comment in the chat from Aidan and Abberton, who says, could Koopmeiners play as a centre back in a back three, which is something we talked about actually a little bit in the chat. But I'll let you respond to Joe as well. But if you could touch on that too.
Definitely he could do that. I mean, that's what he played that in his second season for RZ. I think playing on the left of a 3, but yeah, he would certainly be that for us, the left side of a 3. I don't think him being able to do that is in doubt. It's just not what we're after here. But yes, he could do it.
And what about the ball carrying stuff?
I think it's definitely a fair question, and he's not out of this list here. He's definitely not on the top of that. But I don't think that it's something that he can't do. But maybe he wouldn't be carrying the ball through a lot of pressure. It might be more like he could he could happily carry it forwards if there's space, basically, rather than sort of one of these players that we're going to talk about. That's probably one of his main skills, which we definitely can't say that about Koopmeiners.
And then just touching on, I guess, the value, we've got Koopmeiners down as 26 million on 5 yards. You think that's a little bit toppy, Josh, right?
I do, which is funny because it's basically me that's caused that price to be that. But I think that feels a little bit toppy to me. I feel like he might be available more like 22 maybe. That's where my instinct is anyway. I don't know what you think about that, Joe.
I mean, 26 million is always going to be sort of a high figure for any player leaving the Eredivisie, particularly one who isn't sort of an attacking player where you typically would see more extravagant sums. So yeah, I'd probably agree with that assessment, really.
Well, let's move on to talk about our next player, who is Manuel Locatelli, who is a player at Sassuolo in Serie A. I have the pleasure of being able to talk about Manuel Locatelli, and I've had a great time spending hours watching him back. It's a player I really, really like. For those of you who don't know him, he started out in the Atalanta youth system before moving into Milan as a young player as well. He's got 48 appearances for Milan, but Paolo Maldini decided he didn't like him, and so he was sent out on loan to Sassuolo, who have ended up spending the money for him, and he's now had a good number of appearances for them as well. I think at Milan they probably regret selling him, having seen how well he's played since then. Sassuolo are currently in 8th in Serie A. They play something between a sort of 4-2-3-1, which can sometimes look like a 4-4-2, and a 3-4-3 as well, although they don't do that so much these days. And he plays as a double pivot in that two-man midfield in both systems. So he'll either be in the double pivot in the 4-4-2, 4-2-3-1, or in the two-man midfield in the 3-4-3. So again, we're talking about a player who has largely played as, I suppose, a little bit of a deeper lying player during his career. This season, he has had 25 appearances for Sassuolo. I was looking through their season, and they've only played one game outside of Serie A games, which was a Coppa Italia loss to Spal in the round of 16. He didn't even play in that game, and he missed another game because of an injury. Because of a suspension. And so as a result of that, he's only had 25 appearances in Serie A. So I guess a player who, weirdly, in the current scenario, in the current climate, has not actually played a huge amount of minutes recently. But looking at his statistics is very interesting. I've looked at both this season and last season. One of the things I noticed in all the players that we've looked at is that their pressures this season are down quite a bit, which I suppose worried me a little bit because of what we were talking about before. But actually, looking back, Locatelli was putting up about 17 pressures per 90 last season. Which is now down at like 13.5 pressures per 90 this season, which is around what Kalvin Phillips puts up. Sorry, the 17 upwards. I think Phillips is around 20 per 90, just from the top of my head. If you look at actually his performance in pretty much every area, he's just a standout player. He's good at going forward. He's got decent expected assists, gets into the final third a lot. He has really good forward passing. He has really good long passing as well, and his tackles his volume of tackles and his tackle success rate are through the roof this season as well, which is really good to see. In terms of his style of play, I've split it into defensive and offensive again. In terms of 1v1 defending, I think Locatelli is a solid defender. I've already mentioned his volume of tackles and his success rate. I think indicates that he's obviously a good tackler. I think if he was playing in a Dallas-esque role as well, he would be fine defensively. I think he plays in a system where you largely have to do that sort of zonal defending, where you have to you track your player when they drop deep, but then when they push forward, you can leave them to go a little bit, which is what we've seen Dallas doing this season. In terms of transition, Locatelli does a very similar job to Kalvin Phillips, I think. So in defensive transition, he's dropping with players and forcing them wide. And then when they go wide, he drops into the back line to help out. I think he's probably a little less agile than Kalvin Phillips, but I think it's pretty close either way. And I would have absolutely no problem him playing in the defensive midfield position in that respect. He's one of those players, I think, who has deceptive pace insofar as, he's a tall guy, he's fairly well built, similar to Koopmeiners, and I think sometimes that can give the impression that they're a bit slow and a bit lumbering, and I don't think that's the case. I think he's got a good top speed, and I don't think there would be any issues with him in transition. Obviously, at Leeds, you expect to do a lot more running, which I suppose would be another problem to talk about, but I think he would be fine in that respect. And then in terms of positioning, I think he's a really smart player, but it's kind of hard to get a handle on the quality of his positioning when you're playing as part of a double pivot sitting in front of a defence. But I think he's a smart player, so I don't think that would be too much of an issue. And then offensively, his progressive passing, both short and long, is really good, similar to Koopmeiners. I don't think his ball striking is as good as Koopmeiners, but I don't think many people in world football have ball striking as good as Koopmeiners. He's also very good with both feet, which I think is important. And I think he's, unlike Koopmeiners, I think he's both good at that quick short passing to get out of trouble, but he's also someone who can shift the ball and get out of trouble as well. In terms of the build-up, which I think is important for both the Dallas and the Kalvin Phillips position, Sassuolo build up similar to Leeds with the DMs helping in the build-up and then trying to feed the ball into the wide areas, so he would be fine in that regard. And I think they go maybe a little bit more central more often than Leeds, but I think Locatelli with his progressive passing is really good in that regard as well. My big worry, I guess, at first was sort of carrying, as we talked about in the last question. But I spent a lot of time today just watching as many dribbles and carries that I could find on Scout, and actually think that Locatelli's pretty good at carrying the ball. And in that respect, I could see him playing the role that Dallas has played this season quite well. He does get dispossessed sometimes, especially when he's slowed down on the ball. So if a player can get him to slow down and then attack him when he's static, he can be a little bit vulnerable. But I think once he's moving, he's got an okay top speed, and he's much more press resistant than Dallas in that respect as well. And then I mentioned earlier that wide play is quite important, and I noted that Locatelli does actually move into wide areas quite a lot of the time, has a decent crossing ability, and I can see him fitting into that wide 8 role quite well as well. So helping out with build up in between the fullbacks and the wide players as well. So in that respect, I think that Locatelli is a pretty decent option for this kind of position, and I would be interested to hear what you guys have to say.
Who's going to take the bait? Is it going to be me or Hobbsy?
You go first, mate.
Yeah, well, I mean, with Locatelli, I think he's a very combative player. I think that's what one of the first things that stands out. He's very rangy, which interesting that you mentioned. You went and watched sort of his carrying, John, because that was sort of one of the things that watching Sassuolo last season, I did think was actually probably one of his strong suits, was that he was able to just open his legs and he would be able to carry through pressure, through midfield. And I think in terms of comparisons to Koopmeiners, I think if you shedded maybe about 5-10 pounds off Koopmeiners and maybe he grew his hair out a little bit, I think you might have Locatelli there, because they're similar in that sense. But I just think that Locatelli's a bit more slender, a bit more athletic, a bit more willing to be that Dallas type player where he's going to pick up the ball, he's going to open his body up straight away, and he's going to be looking up for that run. He's going to take it forward, as opposed to Koopmeiners, whose first thought is going to be, right, where can I ping this? So I think the one thing about Locatelli is that you've got Sassuolo, who are a team who, I mean, 8th in Serie A, who could make a push for European football. I don't think it would be too much of an issue trying to lure him to Leeds, because obviously there's your profile increases when you become a Premier League player, of course. But with these sorts of Italian players, I think it's less common, as you might see in France or Spain or Germany or the Netherlands, for example, that they would leave Italy and come to England and come to the Premier League to play in that role. I think it's a lot more prevalent from players in other nations, in other top 5 leagues, to come over. So I think if there's not an incredible offer for Locatelli, both in terms of fee, both in terms of what Leeds can offer him, then I think it would be difficult to bring him to the club, because at the moment he's got a pretty solid setup. He's an integral member of this Sassuolo squad. It's very much on the up. It's got like lots of young talent. You know, your Raspadori's up front, Jeremy Boga, Mulder on the wing. Like, you know, there's talent there. So I think it would have to be a real sell of a project to get him to come across. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, to be honest.
The other thing to mention as well is that Locatelli will be he'll be an asset this season, which this summer that a lot of clubs will be looking at, and a lot of very good clubs. So I've got an extract here from 5 Yards asking what club he would be perfect for, and Manchester City being named there is hardly going to inspire us that we're going to be able to pit them to a player like Locatelli. And obviously the last line there, I have no doubt that Locatelli will be playing for one of the Europe's elites next season as well. So I do think that Locatelli is going to be in demand. I think that he's good enough to play Champions League football, no questions asked. And I think, you know, this is very much a scenario like, I suppose, like the Rafinha scenario, where you've just got to sort of pray to the gods of football that no one comes in with an offer if you wanted to get a player like this. But Josh, what do you make of the possibility of getting a player like Locatelli?
Yeah, I think my instinct is that he would be, out of all of these, probably the hardest one to get. And yeah, he's definitely not coming to sit on the bench if we were to get him. Whereas even, I mean, I don't think Koopmeiners would come and sit on the bench, but equally it would still be a move to a higher level league, and probably the best league, whereas he's outside of the top 5 leagues. And although Soumaré is playing for the leaders of Ligue 1, he's not starting every game, so he might see a move as something that he would want. Whereas I think Locatelli, you've got to really convince him that you're going to come and be an integral part of this team. So it would really need to be you're going to be the starting 8, but you'll drop in to DM as and when we need you. And then he has to ask, do I want to play that role? I'm pretty comfortable playing this role that I'm already playing for Sassuolo. And yeah, in terms of how I feel about him as a player, yeah, incredible high volume passer. That's the thing that I got straight away from him. Like, you know, you could trust him to carry the majority of your possession, that he could always keep the ball moving for you. And I did actually note down myself that he's really good and can carry the ball through pressure, because he's such a sort of a passer. That's the thing that strikes you first of all. But yeah, I had down that he can do that. He can shift his body weight quickly, move the ball from one foot to the other, and get past a man. I've got down that I think defensively disciplined, could do that really well. It wouldn't be like those times where we saw Rodrigo and Cleek both playing in the midfield together, both running ahead of the ball, and then we lose it in transition, and it's a nightmare. You're not going to see that if he's there. I have more questions about his mobility defensively than I did for Koopmeiners. I know you've sort of already said it's easy to sort of fall into the trap of how he sort of runs aesthetically, but maybe I have done that. But I felt that I feel that he has a bit of a robotic running style. Do you know what I mean? Like he's sort of he looks a bit rigid in the way that he moves. So whereas you sort of see Dallas like going around the field like a whippet. So it'd be interesting whether he could do that.
I think it would be interesting to see sort of how
The other
these
thing
players...
I've got down is he's another one who's hard.
Sorry, Josh.
Sorry, Joe.
Sorry, Joe. I thought you finished, but I was just going to say I think it would be very interesting to see how these players, because it's not as though Stuart Dallas was an incredible middle distance athlete before he started working under Marcelo Bielsa. I think it would be interesting to see how a player like Locatelli, if he was to be coached by a manager for an extended period of time, like Bielsa, even just a full preseason. We know how much how the demands that Bielsa places on sort of body fat percentages and high speeds and that sort of thing. I think it'll be intriguing to see how he would develop these players sort of physiologically. As in the same way, because we're looking at Mateusz Klich, who's covering more ground than every player every single game. We're looking at Stuart Dallas, who Josh is talking about there, who doesn't seem rigid or robotic. He just seems to glide. And I think you'd be hard pushed to find any Leeds player who isn't in the best nick that they ever have been. So you'd have to think that if you were willing to spend X amount of money on an addition, it would be because you think that they are capable of getting on board physically with the demands that the coach is going to want.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point, because I think both with Koopmeiners and Locatelli, the only players we have in the lead squad with similar body shape and build are centre backs, and that's what it comes down to, right? Which is why I guess I was suggesting maybe Koopmeiners. It's fine playing them in that defensive midfield position, I think, because Bielsa sees that as a sort of third-ish centre back who's fairly mobile. Both of which those players would be. The big question is how they would fit into a system where they are expected to just run and run and run and run. And I think the bigger you are, the more weight you're carrying necessarily, and you can be the fittest in the world. But I guess if Bielsa considers you to be not up to the ability of going backwards and forwards, in a sort of thankless task approach, then that will probably count against you. But let's move on. I think we, in terms of the interest of time, I want to give you a decent chance to talk about Soumaré, Joe, because I think he's quite a different player from these two. So I'm quite keen that we have some discussion of him.
Yeah, well, Soumaré is, he's a player that I've liked for quite some time. Obviously, involved with the French under-21 setup. He's in, one of the integral players at Lille. He has been over the past 2 years. He flits in and out of the team, but I think they're better with him than without him. And I think there are quite a few. I mean, I say quite a few. There are probably about 3 or 4 main facets to his game, and it's his distribution, his ball carrying, and his defensive output. I think they're sort of the three main things that stick out when you watch Boubakary Soumaré. And first of all, I'll go with his distribution, because it's obviously, if we're looking at a number 8 who can sort of drop in and play as a 6 if needs be, then I think distribution's a big point that you're going to need to, a big box that you're going to need to tick. And I think he wins my vote in that sense, because he is a top level distributor over a variety of distances. He has that range. He has the Koopmeiners range. He has the Phillips range. Ranks very highly for through balls, for those switches that we see so often. I think he averages 8. It's something like 8 or 9 passes into the final third per 90, according to FBref.com. 7 progressive passes per 90. So, you're putting yourself in sort of the top 5% of midfielders across Europe's top 5 leagues with those sort of statistics. So I think in a team who, dominate possession even more, then there's the potential that would scale up even further. One of the things that about Mateusz Klich that I really like is that he's very good at receiving under pressure. He doesn't seem as though he's overawed when he's being harassed on the ball. And that's one thing that I quite like about Soumaré as well. He's very adept under pressure, still makes those passes. And being able to receive in the middle of the pitch, there's no point having a Kalvin Phillips or a Teun Koopmeiners behind you if the passes that they're playing into the midfielders, into number 8, is just going to be squandered immediately. You need to have sure footing in there. And I think that Soumaré is certainly that type of player who is going to take the ball, has that 360 vision, very comfortable playing off both feet. I mean, he is predominantly right-footed, but he's both-footed, really. He's got that 360, ability. He's got a full turn in circle. And that's even before we get onto sort of his ball carrying. And he is a progressive carrier by nature, as well as a bit of a progressive passer as well. So I think he's multi-talented, multifaceted. He's a dual asset there. The only issue that I've got with Soumaré is that in terms of his defensive output, his pressing is my main concern. It's probably the one area where you think, am I going to spend the 30, 40 that could be demanded on a player who's, very easy on the eye in terms of with the ball, but, might not be at the required fitness level or required work rate of a Bielsa team, and sort of at the very least might require a lot of work to get up to speed. Because, if we just compare it in terms of PPDA, Lille's is around 10, whereas Leeds is around 6.5, 6.75. So there's an explainer as to it's a bit of a get out of jail free for Soumaré in terms of his low pressing stats, but it goes to show why his pressing numbers are a bit lower. But if you were looking for him to come in as a number 8, then those pressures need to come up a long, long way, because at the moment he's on around 11 per 90. And given that Lille tend to share a similar amount of possession to Leeds, then, he's not as sort of straight on the opponent when Lille give up the ball, because he's on 11 per 90, clicks on 21 pressures per 90. So it's a big jump. And I think it's maybe not one that you could broach or remedy in one pre-season. So I think there's room for improvement, and obviously we're talking about young players here, so of course there's room for him to be molded, but it's whether you spend a certain amount of money on a player who perhaps isn't the best at what is essentially a key part of this 8/6 role.
Yeah, the pressuring side is really interesting, because I think of the 4 players that we looked at, Soumaré is the most mobile, the most agile, and the most athletic. And I guess that was my big question with him, is that it is all well and good being agile and mobile and whatever, but it's what you do with that agility and mobility, and that would be on the one hand, yes, I think you're right insofar as the team style that he's playing in isn't anything like Leeds at the moment, but I do feel as though there is potential that he could be sort of molded into that position, as you've said. Whether or not it would take a pre-season or more, as you said, I don't know. But I think one thing that is certain is that we do need to make sure that we have the right personnel in that midfield too, because we really suffer from, I think, having Rodrigo and Dallas and Click in the same midfield, and to an extent with Dallas as well, because as we've said, Dallas doesn't press as much as anyone else in our midfield. He is a little bit more zonal. He is a little bit more circumspect. And the big question for me is whether or not we carry on with that. Do we carry on with a player who is a little bit more circumspect in pressure, in defensive pressure, or do we ideally want to be at a point where we can have 2 players who are just both at that highest level of elite pressing, and go from there? I'll move this over to you, Josh, because I'm interested in your take in all of this. How do you see Soumaré as a defensive player?
Yeah, I did notice that he didn't press as much, although I thought that he looked as a good enough presser in the team that he was in. Like where he needed to, I felt that he did do that. Although I watched, I had more issues actually in some of his maybe defensive awareness more than his pressing. Lille lost to Ajax in the Europa League, and he let his man sort of run off the back of him to get the assist for Brian Brobby's winning goal. And that was a little bit of a red flag to me, because obviously as in a man marking system, you've got to be aware of where your man is all the time. And obviously that he wasn't playing a man marking role there, but he just didn't seem to be aware at all that he had, I think it was Davy Klaassen running in behind him. He's not the most incredibly mobile player there, but he got completely caught out by him. So that was a bit of an issue for me. But I would still say that I think to play the 8, Soumaré is actually my favourite.
Yeah, and we should point out as well that this season his pressing is down at whatever 10.2 this season per 90. The previous season it was up at 16.2, which is still below average, still concerning, I think. But what's so interesting about this season is how so much of teams other than Leeds have just dropped their pressing right back because of the pandemic and because of the great aggregation of games that they've had. So I do think that there are signs there that he could do that, and I suppose that would be my concern, whether or not you can get a player like that into a pressing system and I guess an aggressive pressing system as well. I'm with Josh on this. I think of the players that we've looked at, he's the most naturally an 8, in the sense that we're talking about. So I guess the corresponding question there then has to be, how do we think that he would be if he played as a defensive midfielder? How do you think that he would be as a D and Joe?
Well, I think you'd have to be very aware that he's perhaps not going, but in the same way that when you had Click and Rodrigo and they were both ahead of the ball, I think you'd have to have awareness in your defence that sometimes Soumaré would not be tucking in as that third central defender, because a lot of his defensive work does come in the middle third for Lille, so that his autopilot is going to be engaging a bit higher up the pitch. And obviously, when you engage higher up the pitch, there are more opposition teammates, and there's more space for your opponent to bypass you. So I think, again, that would be another area where I'd perhaps think that maybe there needs to be some coaching. But as you both said, as an 8, I think probably the best fit athletically and also in terms of sort of just the full package in terms of his distribution. I certainly think that in terms of scalability, as you were saying there, John, with the 16 pressures last season per 90, I think that he is the player who scales up the best. It's just whether, if the question is, I'm turning the question back on you, but the question is, could he do the deputy role in the 6? Honest answer, I don't know. I think, I'd have to see him as a single pivot, which he just hasn't played enough of.
Yeah, it's really tricky with some of these players as well, because when you play, because all of these players are sort of playing as pivots in the build-up that they play, but they're given huge amounts of time and they drop in and they're not expected to do the defensive work that Phillips is expected to do. So it's a really unique position that we're looking for in terms of a defensive midfielder, which I think complexifies issues. But given the interest of time, I do want to give Josh some time to talk about Max Bird, who I think is a really interesting
We've
option.
forgotten the price of Soumaré.
Yeah, we haven't talked about it. So Soumaré is what, 22 million?
No, he's 26 as well. 26 or 26.5.
Yeah, I don't think I mentioned Locatelli's price at 20 million, which is way below, I think, what we would say market value was as well. But what do we make of Soumaré for 26 million? It seems a little bit low to me, perhaps.
I think it's low because we've seen the price tags that have been quoted for him beforehand. If this is the first time that we'd discussed price tags or seen any Soumaré price tags, I think we'd probably say that's probably quite fair for a player who is at the top of Ligue 1 at the moment. Champions League, Europa League experience. Probably playing his way into a better team at, if not Ligue 1 level, but at a better top 5 European league. I'd probably say it's a fair price.
Well, let's move over to you now, Josh, because you want to talk a little bit about Max Bird.
Yeah, so he's a bit more the young option, maybe to play a few.
Well, we seem to have lost you, Josh. I guess we'll wait and see what happens. I think he'll probably drop out and pop back in again. But in terms of Max Bird, what Josh is saying there is that Max Bird is the young option that Phil Hay's been talking about a lot. We've seen in recent. We've seen him talking about that in recent months, and I guess the big question there is what happens when you bring in a player to play as a backup to Kalvin Phillips. Obviously, you can't bring in any of the players that we've been talking about because they are, they're players who are playing well at big size and are expecting, 100% of the minutes available. So yeah, the big question with that then is, who do you bring in who is happy to sit on the bench? And you obviously have to dip into the championship there. I think we've got Josh back, so I'm going to add him here. I don't know if you could hear that, Josh, but I could
hear. Cool, okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're back now.
That's good. I feel like I could drop out again.
Yeah. No. So what's your take on?
Can you get me if I talk?
I think you're just a bit laggy.
Talking about him playing less of the minutes. Okay. So I think he's very tidy on the ball. I think you could trust him with a high volume of possession, similarly to, as I was saying about Locatelli. Good press resistance, but he's not going to be like turning midfielders inside out and carrying the ball through. He moves the ball sharply. He can shimmy away to create space for himself, but it's about his passing. So if he's spinning away, it's so that he can give the ball to a fullback or punch the ball through midfield rather than do a load of ball carrying. Whereas I think with Soumaré, you might see him turn someone inside out and stretch his legs through midfield. He mostly plays short passes, but if he's got the space, he will switch the play. He's probably not going to be doing that all game like you might see Kalvin Phillips do or Koopmeiners would do. I think he's got good awareness to find space and build up. He's a good scanner. He covers ground well, so I think he'd cope well with the pressing. But my issues with him defensively, I don't know if he's quite aggressive enough in going to win the ball. There was a goal recently against Stoke where he got out to the man and then he just sort of he gave him too much space to swing the ball in, really, rather than get out to the man and then go to make a challenge and swung the ball to the back post and they scored. And physically, he doesn't have the build of these other players that we've talked about. So I think he could be bullied a little bit more. So he could do with adding a little bit of muscle. He's tall but fairly skinny. That's what I've got for him. But I still feel that he would be someone I would trust more in that role than, for example, a Jamie Shackleton.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing with Bird is that he probably feels, again, like one of these players who's maybe more of a defensive midfielder than an 8. But I guess in this situation, you're not worried so much because you can just sit him on the bench and just use him as a backup to Phillips entirely.
He has played in 8 a few times. That's one of the things that I liked about him, that he's I feel that he's more multifunctional than some of the others. He has played more of his minutes as a deeper midfielder, but I think he even started as the furthest forward of a 3 recently. I didn't particularly like him in that role, but as an 8, I'm comfortable with him.
Was that a genius move by Rooney, or? Yeah,
I think they lost.
Yeah, but that wouldn't really distinguish from any of the results recently. But I'll come to you, Joe. What's your general take on Max Bird?
Well, I think with Max Bird, I mean, it's pretty much everything that Josh has said, really. He's a tidy player. I think he's good Championship standard. I mean, I think he looks comfortable in possession. I think he'd be fine in a possession-based team. I think it would just be the off-the-ball stuff for me that would be where I'd maybe have a bit of a, not concern, but just, is this essentially the best use of resources? Because, we've mashed him in here with the likes of Locatelli, Koopmeiners and Soumaré. And I mean, no disrespect to Max Bird, but you would pick any of the other three ahead of him. If you sort of had an unlimited budget, wouldn't you? Because they're just playing at a higher level. And yeah, even Koopmeiners is playing in the Eredivisie, but he's playing European football, he's playing international football. I just think that if you were going to have a backup, a deputy for a number 8 or a number 6, predominantly the number 6, then if you were going to sign somebody, I don't know, I just feel like I'd rather have a high quality number 8 deputizing as a number 6 rather than somebody who is probably top level championship as your deputy number 6, because you're limiting the what's the word? You're limiting the floor of your team. You're setting it quite low, essentially. He's the youngest in this list. I'm well open to be proven wrong about him. And yes, Derby, he's not exactly playing in a great team at the moment, but I just think that if you have other options on the table, I'd be going with them.
I guess the only response
I don't dispute any of that.
The only response I would have would be that Kalvin Phillips was in a similar position when Bielsa arrived at Leeds. Which again, that's not to say that Bielsa can sign anyone and make them into a good player. By no means, don't get me wrong. But I guess that has to be at the back of our minds. The other thing is the price, because I think Bird is down at 12 million in 5 yards. So obviously that's much cheaper than it would be if we were getting any of these other players. So I think that comes into play as well. But yeah, I'll give you the right to reply here, Hobbsy, just on Joe's criticisms of Bird.
To be honest, I agree with a lot of it. I suggested him for this list sort of as the I guess the one that you would sit in there as your your backup option if you can't go get one of these slightly more glamorous names. He's one that you might think to try as well, and particularly is something that we've heard Phil Hay talk about. Leeds potentially looking at a younger player that they can mould to sit behind Phillips, and I think we've all agreed that we don't think that either of these other three are going to come and join Leeds and sit on the bench and sit behind Kalvin Phillips. So they have to start as the 8. So yeah, I think he could start as the 8, but he wouldn't start anywhere near the amount of games that the others would.
I'm conscious of the time, so I do want to quickly just run through the honourable mentions because I completely forgot to do it in the first episode. But the names that people had been putting out, one was Zambo Anguissa at Fulham, which I think a lot of people like him because he's obviously a baller when you watch him play, and we've played against Fulham a couple of times now, so you get a good chance to see him. Fulham for a long part of the season were potentially going down as well, so I guess that automatically makes you think that he might be available. In terms of other players,
harsh on Joe there.
Fulham were going down. I think you'll find they're still in the bottom 3.
They are, and sorry, I've opened the right can of worms there. So I'll move Hobbsy on to do you want to talk a little bit about Shackleton, because you're a massive fan of Shackleton and a lot of people would see him as a viable option here.
Yeah, I do love Shackleton, and I did a whole thread about him after he played in midfield against Wolves, and I thought he did a really good job, and then he got injured, which seems to happen every single time he comes in and plays well. He gets injured. I think he's low-key one of the most injury-prone players in our team, because every time he gets a game in midfield and does well, and you think he's going to have a run of games now, his body doesn't let that happen. And that's why we've seen Dallas play in midfield so many times. And yeah, I actually think Shackleton, I would always be happy to have Shackleton as an 8, but I would not be happy to have Shackleton as the 6. So I'm ruling that out on that that particular reason. And I think it could, if Leeds bought a couple of midfielders, it could be possible that we might loan him out. I don't want to see that, but I think that is a possibility.
Yeah. Did anyone else want to mention any other names that we could have considered here?
Just on Shackleton, I feel like if we're putting Max Bird into the discussion, who's predominantly going to play as a number 8, save yourself 12 million and play Jamie Shackleton instead. I think that he's shown enough that yes, if he can stay fit, then I can't. I think if you bring in somebody like Max Bird, it's marginal gains as opposed to major gains, and you're kind of splitting hairs at that point, and you're siphoning away minutes from Shackleton. He doesn't get that many as it is. So bringing in a player who's probably at a similar, if not lesser, level than him, I think you could maybe put that money elsewhere.
I agree with that as an 8. I don't think I agree with that.
Not as a 6.
I don't think I agree with that in defensive midfield. Yeah.
Well, should we talk about price then? I'll just shove the price list up again. So yeah, Teun Koopmeiners 26 mil, Boubakary Soumaré at 26 mil as well, Manuel Locatelli at the laughable price of 20 mil, and then Max Bird at 12 mil. So where are we going to go on these guys? Does someone want to kick us off in terms of order of preference? Let's go with you, Joe. What's your order of preference on these players?
If we're going with based on those prices, then I'm finding it very difficult to turn down Locatelli. I mean, that's not to say that I think that he would first of all be attainable for that price, and if he was, I don't think he'd come. Regardless, I mean, in the interest of realisticness, it's not a word. Then
reality.
There we go. If only there was a shorter variation. I think I'd be going with Soumaré as my number 1 pick. Probably then Locatelli and Koopmeiners are probably very, very closely tied second, and then Max Bird 4th. I think the extra 6 million for Soumaré for somebody who can also play as the 6 is probably money well spent, in my opinion.
Josh?
Yeah, I'd just say on the price thing, because I have a bit more of the insider info in terms of the prices, but I think partly Locatelli comes out quite cheap on 5 yards because of not being a high contributor in terms of goals and assists, whereas Koopmeiners is boosted a lot. He's 15 goals from midfield this season. And also prices come through trying to predict a player's future. So yeah, I would say Bird 4th, and then I'm going Locatelli 3rd, Koopmeiners 2nd, and I also would pick Soumaré 1st because I think he's the most versatile.
Yeah, I'm very similar to that. I think I would reverse your order of the middle 2, Josh. But I absolutely love Manuel Locatelli. I've had a great time watching him in the last few weeks. I love him so much. I've bought a Sassuolo shirt with his name on the back that I found on eBay. So I'm irredeemable at this point. But I think there's a massive difference between loving a player and seeing how wanting them to play for Leeds, right? I would love to have Locatelli playing for Leeds, but I would love to have him playing in the defensive midfield position. That's never going to happen. That's not what's at stake here. I'm the same with Koopmeiners. I would love to have either of those two playing as a 6 regularly in this team. Again, that's not going to happen. This is probably blasphemy, but I think both of them are better than Kalvin Phillips. But we have Kalvin. We have Kalvin Phillips, and yeah, I've got to do something to antagonise the fan base at some point. But look, Kalvin Phillips is great, and we've got him, and he's a great option as well. And what we're talking about is bring, as you said, Joe, bringing the floor of the squad up. And I think for that reason, I would have to go with Soumaré as well, because I think he gives us something that the other two don't have, and the other two have something which just overlaps so much with Phillips that it just becomes, it would be irresponsible squad building, I think, to bring any of the other two in, unless you were anticipating that Phillips was going to be moving on. So yeah, I think it's funny because I think before we started this episode, Josh was expecting us there to be a fair amount of disagreement on this, but I think this has all come down to the fact that Soumaré is going to offer more in that 8 position than the other 3 players, and as a result of that he's got to be the sort of player that we're looking for. So yeah, I think that means that we've bought Soumaré, right? So
yeah, I'll buy him tomorrow morning when the transfer market opens.
Yeah, and hopefully in the next few weeks we'll start getting some performance pay in as well, so we can talk a little bit about what our squad's looking like with that. But I think that brings us to the end of this week's episode of Orta's List. We'll be back again in 2 weeks' time to talk about attacking midfielders. But until then, if you're interested in finding out more about 5 Yards, do check out their website. Go to 5yards.link/ASAW and search for and have a play around on the website there. But all that remains for me to do is to bring this to a close. I've had a great time. It's been great chatting to you guys. It's always great having the time and the wherewithal to just have these sorts of conversations with people who've spent a lot of time just watching a player in great detail. So I've really enjoyed that. So thank you for that. So yeah, all that remains for me to do is to say thank you to Joe.
No, thank you very much for having me. I hope that we've saved a few people from listening to Lee Dixon describe San Marino players as mannequins, apparently. Got a text from one of my friends, Nathan, midway through that saying that was just not on. And I agree. I don't think it's on. But yeah, I hope we've saved a few people from that. But no, it's been an absolute pleasure to join you guys again and really chew the fat on some 6s/8s.
And do check out the stuff that's going on over at Scouted Football as well, and Leeds Live as well, where you can find Joe. And Josh, it's great to have you on again. Thank you for chatting.
Thanks,
cool.
Yeah, enjoyed that.
So yeah, no, same. So all that remains for me to do is say goodbye to everyone. So goodbye, guys, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time.